This video is now in session, and it's been a while since we last did something related to political maps. So in this video, we're going to talk about 2024. So there's a very high chance that Donald Trump will run for re-election in 2024. He will try to challenge Joe Biden in the next presidential election. And if he does do so, then he'll likely win the Republican nomination. So if he does win the Republican nomination, how would Trump fare with Biden in 2024? Because in the 2020 election, we saw this. If we fill out all of the states, ultimately Joe Biden won by 306 electoral votes, which is just about above the margin of victory that you need to win the presidential election. You need 270 electoral votes, and Joe Biden had 306. So now that we are getting closer and closer to 2024, and now that Joe Biden is trying his hand at governing, how does he stack up compared to Donald Trump? We'll find that out in today's video, and you can see here that as we are filling out the map, it is kind of PTSD from all the things that happened in 2020. I mean, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you can probably have some PTSD from the 2020 election because of just how chaotic it was. But 2024 is going to be somewhat different. The reason why is because there's now a better contrast between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So now that we have Joe Biden governing, and now that he's facing the difficulties that Trump has, we're looking at the possibility of Trump maybe gaining a few electoral votes that he did not in previous elections. But we'll go through that in today's video. So this is the result of 2020. You can see here that this result is kind of different in terms of numerical value from the last election, and that's because between then and now we have had some electoral number changes because of redistricting. We've said this, or I guess reapportionment is the better term to use. We've stated this before, but every decade the U.S. Census conducts a count of every person living in the United States, and then from there they count the population per state and readjust the the electoral college and the House of Representatives accordingly. So here Democrats have lost 3 electoral votes because of reapportionment, because Texas and Florida are gaining 3 electoral votes, and then you have New York, California, and as well as Illinois each losing 1 electoral vote. And then there are other states that have lost and gained electoral votes, but they ultimately cancel each other out between partisanship of Republicans and Democrats. So now we have a 3-seat deficit for the Democratic Party. So comparing 2020 to 2024, a lot of moderates are, as of now, Biden has a higher approval number than Donald Trump had when he was president at this time. So it's likely that Joe Biden will have consistently higher approval ratings than Donald Trump, primarily because he is not a chaotic president. He's not a chaos president. That's, again, objectively speaking, Trump did govern presidency over chaos, with a bunch of protests, a bunch of violence, and comparing that to Joe Biden's presidency, which is at this, albeit kind of muted, it's a very muted presidency, but nonetheless, it's still something that moderates would much rather prefer than a more chaotic presidency, and that was demonstrated in the 2020 election when Joe Biden was able to surpass Donald Trump and dethrone a sitting incumbent. So for this election, what are some differences? Well, we can expect demographic shifts to take place. In Arizona, it's becoming more and more Democratic just because there are more people moving into Phoenix in this area, and from California and from the Northeast. You have a shift happening where people are moving into Sunbelt states, and those people are primarily Democrats. So that obviously benefits the Democratic Party in Arizona. And the other thing is that the Republican Arizona Party has not gotten their act together. We've stated this multiple times, but the Republican Party in Arizona should be focusing on 2022 and should be focusing on trying to elect electable candidates like John McCain. But they're not doing that. They're completely bucking every political insight that they need to follow, and instead what they're doing is they're trying to further change the 2020 election. They're still doing that audit in the state senate by cyber ninjas. So it's just delaying the inevitable, and not only that, it's costing taxpayers money, and it's something that should not really be a focus of many Arizonan politicians. They really should be focusing on the issues, but instead they're focusing on politics, national politics, which, based on history, a lot of constituents don't like that. Based on Virginia in 2019, based on Texas in 2020, people who find their politicians to be nationalizing their candidacy usually do not fare well. So for Arizona, it's likely that the Democrats would end up with at least a lean margin. Definitely not likely, but most likely lean. So that's the first change. The second change is the Rust Belt. In the Rust Belt, what changes can we expect? We can expect something similar to this, but maybe Wisconsin. It could go either way. Wisconsin could either become a lean state, based on Joe Biden's lack of chaos in his governance as of now, or all three of these Rust Belt states could become tilt. It could be either way, just because for the three Rust Belt states to become tilt, that signifies that the Democrats have not been governing enough and they have not been doing enough, which is true. They have not been doing enough in their governing, because as of now, they've really only focused on the pandemic. The only thing that the Democrats have been able to pass, substantial passage, it involves the pandemic relief. But there's also the argument to be made that the three Rust Belt states would be lean, because the pandemic aid definitely benefited the three states right here. So it could go either way, but for the most part, the Rust Belt will continue to stay competitive. Other things that may change: Texas. Texas obviously is still a Republican state. It will be a Republican state for a few more elections to come, but for 2024, there's a real potential for Texas to go from likely to lean, because every single presidential election since 2000, we've seen the Democrats narrow the margin in Texas by a couple of percentage points every single year. So between 2016 and 2020, we saw a relatively moderate shift, or relatively mild shift, towards the Democratic Party, but we can expect that kind of shift to continue in 2024, especially because in 2020, Donald Trump campaigned on the Democrats being accused the Democrats of being a socialist party. And even though some of the things that Democrats are doing are progressive, for the most part, it's not in a negative connotation, and many voters are recognizing that the Democrats aren't really causing much notable and indelible destruction on the United States. Just like how Donald Trump, even though he did a lot of controversial things, he didn't indelibly damage the presidency or the United States. He might have temporarily damaged some things, just like how Joe Biden might temporarily damage some things in the minds of Republicans. But for the most part, the United States is greater than one president. It's greater than one person. So, if we go off of history, which is that in 2016, Hillary Clinton campaigned against Trump and said Trump would not be a fit for presidency and would be the worst president ever. And then when we go through the Trump presidency, even though he did a lot of controversial stuff, many voters didn't feel like that Trump was the destruction candidate that Hillary Clinton stated. So because of that, a lot of voters were fine with voting for Trump in 2020. But we can apply that example of 2016 to 2020 to this election between 2020 and 2024, except it applies to the Republican Party now instead of the Democratic Party. So we can see Texas most likely go to a shift towards a lean state. North Carolina will also most likely go into a tilt state, because even though North Carolina is inelastic, it has been trending increasingly for the Republican, or I guess increasingly for the Democratic Party. So we most likely think it will be a tilt state as of now. And then in Nevada, we can see a possibility where it becomes from a lean state to a tilt state. And the reason why is because the Democratic Party in Nevada is starting to fracture. Harry Reid once dominated politics in Nevada, but now it's becoming a little more moderate. Or I guess rather than moderate is not the best word, but it's becoming more competitive between moderates and progressives. And the problem with that is it's getting to a point where it's fracturing the Nevada Democratic Party. So and so if you combine that with the fact that Joe Biden is not really the type of candidate to bring out Latinos, we can start to see a possibility when Nevada becomes a tilt state instead of a lean state. I mean, Nevada is kind of like North Carolina, and it's in elasticity. So there won't be too much change between now and 2024 in terms of partisanship ratings, but it will be competitive nonetheless. So that's kind of the ratings that we have. If there are other minor ones, New Hampshire most likely will go to a lean state. Florida would most likely stay at their lean status, just because the Democrats so far have not been able to figure out how to do well in Florida. That test will come in 2022 when there's a Senate seat up and a governor's election happening. But as of now, the Democrats haven't shown too much progress in Florida. So this is our ratings for the 2024 election. Oh, and we'd say that Colorado would most likely be safe. Colorado has been trending increasingly for the Democrats in the past couple of years, and we could most likely see it become a shift from 13.5% in favor of Joe Biden to past 15%. So that's the overall rating that we have. It's not too much change from before. In fact, there's not really any flips. But if there are potential flips, it would come from North Carolina. It would come from maybe Texas, if Democrats are good enough, if Democrats are as savvy as Stacey Abrams was. It could come through Nevada. It could come through any of these Rust Belt states. And it could also come through Florida. New Hampshire, possibly, but most likely not. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.